Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, the trial of Derek Chauvin. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. Jurors in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin took less than a day to decide his fate. Guilty on 3 counts for the murder of George Floyd. In communities of color, the guilty verdicts were greeted with shock, relief, and vindication. But even as the handcuffed Chauvin was led away, there were several more police fatal shootings of Black Americans. Are the Chauvin guilty verdicts not so much a victory as they are a reminder that police accountability and true justice are still a long way off? Joining us, Philip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, GBH News, Center for Investigative Reporting. Tanisha Sullivan, Esquire, President of the NAACP Boston branch. She is also a member of the GBH Board of Advisors. Boston Police Detective Larry Ellison. He's also the former president of the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers. Detective Ellison was recently appointed to the Massachusetts Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. Dr. XENIA Johnson-BHEMBE, an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and founder of the Race Recovery Project. But first, BRANDT Williams is joining us from Minnesota Public Radio, where he has been on the ground reporting the story of George Floyd's murder and the Chauvin trial. Hello, BRANDT.
Hi, how you doing, Callie?
How do you describe what's happening there? I mean, there was I think, a desire to have a full-on celebration, but it was tempered by the funeral plans for Daunte Wright and the fact that this is not over yet. Tell us what's happening there now.
Right. So I was downtown outside the courthouse a few minutes after the verdicts were read and was walking through the crowd as people were celebrating and holding signs and celebrating what they felt as a victory for George Floyd and for justice. But I kept hearing people in the crowd saying that there's still more work to be done. There was a man chanting, we need one more conviction. He was talking about the police officer, Kimberly Potter, who shot and killed Daunte Wright. There are activists who are calling now for the state of Minnesota to reopen the cases of the killings of other people throughout the state, not just in Minneapolis. So people, it seems like they feel like perhaps they have a wind at their back that's giving them some energy towards seeking some real reform.
And what about the pattern and practice investigation now launched by the Department of Justice? What will that mean immediately in Minneapolis?
Well, they've already started the investigation. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, U.S. Attorney General, announced that earlier this week. They are going to be digging through all types of data related to policing in Minnesota into Minneapolis. They will be interviewing community members, police officers. They're going to be looking at training materials and procedures. They are looking for, as the name of the investigation implies, patterns and practices of unlawful policing in Minneapolis. And they are going to conduct what could be anywhere from a 6-month to 9-month or longer investigation. If they do find evidence of this type of discriminatory policing, they'll complete a lengthy report, which will be available following that. And they could form a consent decree between the city of Minneapolis and the federal government. And that could be used if the guidelines are not followed by the Minneapolis Police Department. That could result in litigation.
Thank you so much, BRANDT, for joining us, and I'm certain we'll be back in touch with you because the trial of the other officers is coming up later in the summer. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So the reaction here in New England and in Boston has been a little bit mirrored what happened in Minneapolis in terms of that sort of dual response. Philip, let me go to you first. You were on the ground. What was coming across to people? Did they feel like, great, we've done it, or something else?
Well, Brent sort of summed it up in many ways. Here in as you said, Callie, it's pretty much mirrored what happened in Minneapolis in terms of reaction, and pretty much mirrors what's happening around the country. Folks were jubilant about the verdict itself, but acutely aware that the real issue is systemic racism within police departments and the larger question of qualified immunity, whether or not that will remain intact across most police jurisdictions. And so you had folks who were addressing the immediate issue of the verdict in the Chauvin case, but also deeply concerned about reform. Some, of course, calling for defunding the police and whatever that means for various people. Others calling for more moderate, if you will, structural reform of police departments. And you also had folks, for example, in Nubian Square, Boston, quite interesting. One guy who said he's been harassed and arrested several times for selling loose cigarettes. He said now perhaps this will mean they'll stop messing with me. This was his reaction. Another guy was nearly in tears immediately after the verdict, recalling various arrests that he had encountered, and said that now what this means for him is perhaps some level of respect that might be demonstrated by police officers in dealing with people like him.
Okay. XENIA, from a mental health perspective, both personally and then, as you talk to others, I was interested in your saying that you were feeling a sense of anger as well for people congratulating you. Explain.
Right. Well, so this idea, what has come up in the verdict relative to the Chauvin trial, this idea that we are all tied to this phenomenon of whiteness. At least that's how it resonates for me. That, there's a part of me that sort of responds emotionally, but then there's a part of me that goes intellectual. The emotional part of me is angry and in some respects is relieved, but then there's also this level of guilt that I carry because I know in some respects, unconsciously or subconsciously, I'm connected to this phenomenon of whiteness that plays itself out through violence. And my response, and I think probably so the broader response of people who are watching it live or in person, are really experiencing themselves hemied by what is acceptable to whiteness, what is acceptable in white America, and the response to these kinds of actions. So my response emotionally was just the response of sort of guilt, but then the anger came because I said, this is not a process for Black America. This is a process for white America. What is being put on display is the process of white dysfunction. And to congratulate me because white dysfunction has been put on display feels like we are far afield from really reckoning with where the focus of our healing needs to lie as a country.
Tanisha, you said when George Floyd's killing was being protested a year ago that this was emblematic of the knee on the neck of so many people of color. And so that was the proper response. How are you seeing this response to these guilty verdicts now? How does that fit in the context of that?
I will affirm what's already been said. Certainly, there has been a sense of relief because, as we know, there are hundreds of these cases that, one, never make it to a courtroom, let alone end up with a verdict that speaks to accountability. And so a sense of relief that in this instance, we do have the former officer being held accountable. That said, what we're also seeing is a renewed sense of urgency to bring about systemic change across the system, across the country. We've seen over the past few months a number of states taking action to bring about policing reform, and that's great. But what we really need is reform nationally. And so we've heard, of course, now renewed calls for the passing of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. And I do believe that that is appropriate. I also think it's critically important for us to remember that the issue of systemic racism goes well beyond policing. It impacts, it reverberates throughout our society and shows up in many aspects of our daily lives. And so this work does indeed continue for all of us.
And Larry Ellison, people will look at these verdicts and have looked at them and thought first step toward police accountability, toward the kind of reform that Tanisha is raising up and that others have mentioned. But you're kind of, you're making the point that it's hard to reform biases. And in fact, your worry is that in a few weeks, people will forget about the Chauvin verdict and go back to business as usual.
Unfortunately, yes. Without partners like Tanisha and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and others keeping an eye on this, as well as organizations such as MAMLEO, that is my biggest fear, because you cannot defund racism, right? It's something that people live with every day. And I've always told people that, my 10 years as the president of MAMLEO, the racial disparity that we had to deal with amongst the Black officers, that I'm not surprised that those things spill out to the public. And we've been warning folks is, look, if they treat us in this way, you should not be surprised that you're being treated in this way, and that we are not part of the problem. We want to be part of the solution. But we really haven't got much support. And I'm glad to see that people are now paying attention. But I do fear that the attention will go. They're looking at this as a sprint rather than a marathon.
Is this accountability, real accountability, Larry Ellison, a police accountability? Will not only your fellow officers, but those around the country see this is 3 guilty verdicts for one officer? And that's a heavy statement by the jury.
It is, but this is just one instance, right? Because you had a video that showed 9 minutes and something. So what happens if it's in less time? What is the appropriate time? What is the appropriate behavior that officers will be held accountable? So this instance, I think it was just so overwhelming. But we've had, I believe it was Mr. Gray in New York that was held to the ground and lost his life over loose cigarettes. It wasn't over 9 minutes, but still, in my opinion, that was not justified.
So police reform in Boston, Philip, there had been efforts moving. It feels like there's a lot more energy around that, not just because of the Chauvin trial, but because some other scandals going on in the Boston Police Department. What's the sense now that this is a kickoff to a step toward justice?
Well, I think that it's inspirational. I think, as all our speakers and guests have said, this is unprecedented in many ways. Some have pointed to the Walter Scott case in North Carolina as saying, well, no, it's happened before. But you have to remember, he wasn't convicted. His conviction, the police officer who killed Walter Scott, he was never convicted. That came about as a judge's decision, his discretion. As far as in Boston, all the mayoral candidates so far are talking about police reform. You have the Massachusetts legislature that have implemented some degree of reform. But I think there is a major disconnect between what folks on the ground want, which they really want to address the issue of qualified immunity. Unless that's addressed in its structural manifestations and its direct impact on policing, then many on the ground feel this is problematic. You can have cameras, you can have eyewitness testimony, you can have all types of things and not change the fundamental modalities of policing. And so that is the concern for many on the ground. But it is also inspirational for those in politics. Acting Mayor Jady has talked about structural reform, as have every single, Andrea Campbell, every single candidate has talked about it in a more substantive way than anything we've so far seen. But this is how they envisage it. It's a question of it actually being implemented with the help of, again, the Massachusetts legislature. Nothing can happen without real, more massive reform from the State House.
So, Tanisha, let's pick up on the qualified immunity. That is right at the heart of some disagreement around the George Floyd Police Justice and Policing Act, which at this moment actually has some, quote, bipartisan discussion between Karen Bass on the Democratic side and Tim Scott, Senator who is black, on the Republican side. But that's really where it comes down to. And yet, Tanisha, we know that cities and towns, and in fact, Minnesota had to pay millions and millions of dollars to these families, which of course means something wrong happened here. So even if the individual police officer is not charged, the city, the taxpayers are paying for this.
Absolutely. So I served on the Boston Police Reform Task Force and also was actively involved with the legislation, that the policing reform legislation that passed here in the Commonwealth. And specifically on this issue of qualified immunity, that was indeed one of the sticking points for us here in Massachusetts with respect to the bill that ultimately passed. And what we know now is that that issue was punted to a commission here in the Commonwealth to further study it. On the national level, specifically as it relates to qualified immunity, it is part of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. The issue here, in many respects, is that I'm not sure that there's a complete understanding among the electorate writ large about what qualified immunity is. It really, qualified immunity serves to provide civil protections from members of law enforcement against kind of personal liability, right? And so if we have situations like what we've seen in Minnesota, specifically with Derek Chauvin, if we have police-involved misconduct in this way, the reforms to qualified immunity would essentially allow for, would essentially take away some of the protections that the government would otherwise provide to a member of law enforcement who was, performing her duty in accordance with the law. So this is not about good police officers. This, in many respects, qualified immunity, the reforms in qualified immunity would impact those members of law enforcement who are engaged in wrongdoing. And we do need to see changes there. But again, that does continue to be a sticking point for police unions, but it also remains one of the top issues that advocates will continue to fight for on the ground.
Larry Ellison, what's your response to the qualified immunity and on the new commission that you're a part of, which is separate from the one that Tanisha just referenced? There's another police commission reform that's kicking off actually in July. They're just getting started. The commission that you're on really focuses on training and the elimination of some techniques that we've heard about, like chokeholds and whatever, to sort of reduce the violence. So can we move forward? How can we move forward in getting past a qualified immunity? Will that ever happen from your vantage point?
I'm sure at some point it probably will happen. My only concern with it is that because of where I've sat as president of MAMLEO and saw the selective choosing of who they would protect and who they wouldn't, if it's done fairly, I think people will be held more accountable. But my fear, as Tanisha knows, we've gone through her with a lot of these cases, is will it be dealt with fairly, that everyone will be in the same pot? And I just don't believe right now that's the case. I haven't seen enough that makes me say, okay, I don't have a problem because I don't conduct myself in that way. But even if I don't, if there's an accusation, I'll be left out there alone trying to defend the matter and try to figure out how I'm going to be able to take care of my family, just defending what took place.
So on the commission that you are now serving, I know you all have just got announced, you haven't met or anything. What will be the power of, it appears to me that the commission is focusing on that training, of reshaping what the training looks like?
Well, again, we haven't had that meeting yet. We're going to swear it in on Monday. I think it will have a lot of subpoena powers, but what I like about it is it allows us to go back and look at some of these cases that have been questionable, right, and get a fresh set of eyes on it. And I think most people look at the recent uptick regarding Officer Pat Rose, who is the allegations of him. Cases like that are very serious, and it's troubling for me as a police officer as well as why that wasn't given the attention and actually determination that should have taken place back then. So I think having that authority to go back and look at some cases like that would be helpful in showing some transparency to the public that people hadn't gotten away with that, and people still could be held accountable for those things.
Ellie, could I just?
Sure.
There's one point I want to make. So the Post Commission, yes, it has a training focus, but one of the key and I think most important powers of that commission relates to certification and decertification. For the very first time in Massachusetts, we will have a requirement that members of law enforcement are certified to do their job. And if they engage in certain misconduct, they run the risk of being decertified, delicensed, if you will, meaning they can no longer be members of law enforcement in the Commonwealth. That is huge.
Okay.
That is potentially a game changer here.
Would you say that's equal to qualified immunity in terms of its impact?
So it's we need both. but surely having really the power to decertify does hopefully will cause many members of law enforcement to be more mindful of their compliance with the use of force standards that are set forth by the commission.
And I just say quickly,
yeah, sure.
Quickly, I think it's in the short term, I think Tanisha is correct that people will start to realize that their behavior is being scrutinized a lot more closely than in the past.
And Callie,
Go ahead, XENIA.
You were about to ask me a question, and I definitely wanted to follow up with what Tanisha and Larry were saying about the idea of this on the mental health stage is that it's a public display, right? And these are public processes. It's hard to imagine. I think everybody thinks about racism as an individual act, but this is a social construct that occurs publicly and socially. And so when you see reforms that are happening potentially in the police department or in law enforcement, those are public decisions and public changes that then potentially change the public discourse around these actions that we feel impacted by on a social level. So they do have huge mental health challenges. I like to say, mental wellness is a part of racial justice, and that's where we start.
And Larry, just this question, from just trying to gauge police response across the country, it seems to me that black officers, as they often do, have a dual response to a Derek Chauvin verdict. Am I reading that right?
Well, you are, but I think a lot of us, I'll be honest with you, Kelly, we don't take the responsibility of that, right? I was a black man before I became a police officer, and I have to deal with a lot of the issues that black men, black people in general, have to deal with, and that's never forgotten and lost with me, And then, like I said, in my career over 30 plus years, I thought when I came on this job that things would gotten better, and they haven't gotten much better when it comes to race. And it's not just in law enforcement, it's health disparities, education. The laundry list is long. Right now, the police department policing is in the forefront. But if you look at most professions, you won't find anything different, as maybe not the violence or the death that comes from a police involved shooting. But you won't find a lot of people saying that they're treated fairly being a black person. I tell you, it's exhausting being black in America. Try being a black police officer.
And XENIA, let me just follow up with that and say, remember, this verdict is happening in the context of these other killings. So it feels like we just couldn't have a moment to actually respond to what the meaning of the Chauvin verdicts.
Exactly. And, the truth is we don't have a minute to respond to all of the verdicts that are happening around us, the instances that go publicized and those that don't. As Black people in America, we are constantly being inundated with either direct trauma or vicarious trauma of the racist systems and socializations that occur and go untapped and unchecked around us. So our heart disease, our diabetes, obesity, anxieties, depressions, all come as consequences to living in a racist system and a cesspool that continues to go untreated.
Philip, you have 30 seconds to tell me how much more protesting will be happening connected to Chauvin and going forward.
Connected to Chauvin, probably not much. Connected to concerns about social justice, quite a bit. Folks who are protesting to reopen the Terrence Coleman case, for example, that case of a mentally ill man who was shot to death by police officers in Boston. In other cases, there would be a lot more attention focused on that, as well as cases like the DJ Henry case and Yuri Stamp's case in Framingham going forward.
So it's not over.
It's not over.
Okay. Tanisha, last word from you.
Well, this is a time for us to, again, recommit to our efforts to bring about greater racial equity across this country. This cannot solely be about policing. This must be about all aspects of quality of life, education, economic opportunity, healthcare. We have to, in this moment, continue to fight. We have to continue to protest, but most importantly, we have to continue to seek policy solutions that tackle systemic racism.
Thank you all for joining me. Obviously, this conversation is going to continue, but that's the end of our broadcast, the end of our show. Thank you for joining us. Stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter.
George Floyd mattered. He was loved by his family and his friends. His death shocked the conscience of our community, our country, the whole world. He was loved by his family and friends. But that isn't why he mattered. He mattered because he was a human being. And there is no way we can turn away from that reality.
That was Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison speaking after the Chauvin guilty verdict and the memory of George Floyd. We're on Facebook and Twitter with our post show, continuing our discussion on the trial of Derek Chauvin. One of the things that is of interest to me is that when it became known that how George Floyd had died and that video was released by Darnella Frazier, the country just coalesced, went to the streets, all manner of folks. So it wasn't just folks of color. There were lots of white people, lots of young people of all races in those protests feeling that this just could not go forward. But then there have been several surveys that since over time, over the year of the pandemic, some of that interest fell off. I wonder now what your takeaway is about the impact of these verdicts. Does that bring people back to the, if not the same sense of urgency, but more attention paid to Black Lives Mattering, as Keith Ellison said? What do you think, Larry Ellison?
Well, let me just first say that is my cousin. So.
Oh, okay. For real?
So it's in the DNA. Wow. Yeah, my other cousin lives here in Boston. He's an attorney here in the Boston area, right? I know. So.
Larry, you've been holding out.
Wow.
Yes.
I did not know that. Okay.
Yes. Absolutely. So, no, I think he's spot on. And you're right. And that's why I said I think those of us who have, all of us have a voice and should speak out. But those of us who have a voice and a platform should speak out even more. And that's why I feel like it's our obligation, folks like Tanisha at the NAACP, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, MAMLEO and such. We need to speak out more, and we have. But more folks need to join. As I said earlier, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that folks will lose attention. Their attention span will be very short again and not getting us to the finish line.
Well, one of the reasons I asked the question, and I want all of you to answer, is that CBS and a couple of other outlets have gotten an interview with one of the alternate jurors. None of the jurors have spoken, but one of the alternate jurors spoke. And she talked about how impactful the testimony was of both Darnella Frazier and one of the forensic experts. But what I was most struck by is she said how is it that somebody, for passing a bad $20 bill, had to die? That does not make sense to me. And this is a white woman, a middle-aged white woman, and she said, I don't understand that. So I was wondering, you know, that was her takeaway of sitting in that courtroom and listening. And of course, as a nation, we've been sitting in the courtroom to some large degree. So what's your feeling, Philip?
Well, you might also ask the question about Dante Wright. Why would someone have to die because they're stopped on the street based on a misdemeanor?
No, I get that. I'm just trying to get to her response. I mean, like being.
No, I get it. I think her response reflected the flagrant, blatant picture that we also. That video was astounding. Someone asked me, how could he not have been convicted? Talking about Chauvin in this case. But there was the possibility that you could have one juror who could have held out. And the reason is because of context. And here's the context, Callie, that I'm talking about. All of this is happening at the same time we see the events of January 6th still being played out also on the national scene. And the reason I bring that up is because when you juxtapose the picture of January 6th, folks rushing into Congress, beating up cops with their own shields, knocking them down, pummeling them, so on and so forth. You have this picture of what would, under most circumstances, folks would call a threat and would call it violence. And then you see individuals being stopped for traffic infractions and shot to death.
Unarmed.
Unarmed. And so that juxtaposition of what is seen as a threat and what isn't, and we now have at least one member of Congress who says even the Capitol Police had determined that the threat was coming from those who might be threatening Trump supporters and not Trump supporters themselves, according to one leaked memo this week. And so when you ask this question, I think about the context of the larger America, that it's not just Chauvin, it's not just folks protesting on the ground, it's also this dynamic of what is perceived as a threat, who is, and so you see this January 6th protest or riot playing out at the same time you see the fallout occurring from the Chauvin case and other similar cases, and we will see this over the summer. And then the question becomes, how is justice basically meted out in the final analysis when we bring all of this together? 410 defendants right now in the Capitol Hill riot. It's believed that very few of them will actually see a prison sentence. And then we, again, juxtapose that with those who are seeing prison sentences for things that are far less consequence in terms of human life, property, and overall destruction.
Tanisha?
Yes, the murder of George Floyd served as a window for so many around the globe into this issue of systemic racism. And the reality is that while the world saw the brutal killing of George Floyd, some of us live the reality of the death of George Floyd every day. And what I mean by that is, for so many, this was their first entree into systemic racism. And that's the reality. And so for them, they're seeing, okay, this has happened. The justice system is working. Chauvin is on trial. We now have a guilty verdict. Okay, that's done. And for those of us who live this every day, we know that George Floyd's murder is but one instance of systemic racism. And so it is incumbent upon us to continue to educate, continue to raise awareness across the country on the larger issue of systemic racism, so that those who had their first window or glimpse of systemic racism last year and were angry about it and called for accountability can join us in the ongoing fight against systemic racism. So it's not surprising to me that we would see some of the polling come in now that we're seeing, where people are saying, you know, maybe it's not as much of an issue, because many of our neighbors just, quite frankly, just did not and do not completely understand systemic racism as a whole.
Larry.
I think, Philip bringing that up about the Capitol was spot on, because, even those of us in law enforcement, they said, how many Black people will even reach the Capitol steps before they would have been taken out? And let's be real about that, right? It wasn't until they were in a space where the officer fired where they couldn't retreat any further. I mean, and that patience is not reserved for Black people when they're stopped in most instances with law enforcement. So you're right. And then the hypocrisy of calling out elected officials claiming like Maxine Waters. Now, I'm not saying that folks should, weigh in when trials are going on. I don't think it's a good idea. But to somehow think that what she said would overturn the trial, and what she said is no different. Matter of fact, it's not nowhere close to what the former president was saying at that rally that invoked that, as well as the congressman from Alabama that got that started. She said nothing that invoked any police officers to go and do anything to anyone, but we see the hypocrisy here when it's a person of color speaking out.
Can I also, I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
One of the other things that I want to make sure we lift up when we reflect on the Chauvin trial is the fact that we had members of law enforcement take the stand for the prosecution.
Yes.
Okay? We haven't seen anything like that before. We had members of law enforcement stand up, take the stand, and speak about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. We need more of that. We need more of that. Yeah.
Can I just follow with Tanisha? But also, Tanisha, remember, we had members of law enforcement who were part of that insurrection, and some of them were here from Boston. So, it's not like that was the bad.
So my point here is, so I don't want to lose this point, Larry, because so very often members of law enforcement come into communities of color, specifically the Black community, and they want cooperation from the Black community to solve crimes, right? And the Black community is oftentimes demonized when we don't speak up and we don't cooperate with members of law enforcement. What I want to call out here is that the same goes for wrongdoing by members of law enforcement. And in this instance, what we saw are members of law enforcement who said, you know what? This is what happened. It was wrong, and there needs to be accountability. We need more of that, because that's the only way that we're really I believe that we're really going to start to see the change we need to see as it relates to policing misconduct, when members of law enforcement begin to hold one another accountable for their conduct.
And I agree with that. And I could just say this quickly. I think that also there has to be an environment, Janice, because, here in Boston, a lot of us have been criticized, we've been taken to task, we've been victimized for speaking out against injustices even within the police department. So if there's no space for that to take place, it most likely won't happen.
And I just wanted to underscore you're right to raise it, Tanisha, the rarity of this, because Larry, I think, if you have pointed out, the police report, the official police report of what happened on that street with George Floyd and Derek Chauvin and those other two officers is wildly different from what the video showed to be true. And I personally just keep thinking back to the case of Laquan McDonald in Chicago, where the police report did nothing related to shooting that young man in the back 16 times. And there were 5 other officers there in addition to the one who did the shooting. And none of them said, you know what, he shot him in the back 16 times, it was wrong. They did not dispute the wrong record. So this is huge.
Callie, I can tell you another impact that's had in terms of reporting, the very point that you're making. I think reporters, journalists are a lot more circumspect now when they read a police report. And I think people will second guess that police report. This is not just true, of course, of the police report we saw with the George Floyd case, but again, bringing up the Walter Scott case out of North Carolina.
Right.
That police officer who was eventually sent to prison for shooting this man to death, again, sentenced by a judge, not by a jury. That report initially said that Mr. Scott attacked him. Almost every report you see, there is some major contradiction, unless, of course, there's video evidence or eyewitnesses who come forward to contradict it. And even then, quite often, many of those officers get off from after following those killings.
So the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would require federal funding for body cameras. Now, I know that's not they're not the be all and end all, but what do you think, Larry Ellison? Is that because you'll be making these discussions on your new commission about how important they are?
Right. I think Philip said we've had video in instances. I don't think the video isn't a cure-all for what ails us. I think a lot of it has to do with training, but also people at the top, the leaders holding folks accountable in a way like we saw in Minneapolis, right? But is that the standard? I mean, because here, I think Tanisha weighed in on as well, the former police commissioner Gross, when our own stats showed the disparity of treatment of officers of color, and he said he was offended by that, and he only saw blue. That's not the right answer when people are showing you your numbers, your own numbers, are saying that there's a problem and you want to just be dismissive of it. So I think making sure that people are going to be held accountable, but putting accountable people in leadership and law enforcement would be a huge step in the right direction.
So final question, what do you want people listening to this conversation, or as the dialogue continues in the next days and weeks, and again, against the context of these new shootings, new cases that'll be going on at the same time, what do you want people to take away as the main meaning from the Derek Chauvin verdicts? Tanisha, I'll start with you.
I think each of us has an opportunity to use our voice and our influence and our vote to help make change. And so I want to encourage folks here in the Massachusetts area to continue to push for the implementation of policing reform, both in Boston, in Springfield, and across the Commonwealth. And for those of us across the country, regardless of who our elected officials are, to lift our voice to advocate for the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
Okay. Larry?
I hope folks treat this, with accountability, not just in law enforcement, but also in the violence that we see amongst ourselves in our communities, right? And that we step up and we have the same vigor in making sure that people are not getting away with harming people in our community, and as well as treating this as a movement and not a moment. And that's my fear, that we're only treating these things as moments, not the movement that it should be.
And Philip?
I'd like to echo both Larry and Tanisha's comments. And I think that one of the main points that should be made is what happens with pressure. Whether that pressure comes from reporters, investigative or beat reporters, looking deeper into a story. The story of George Floyd could have gone in a totally different way again, if not for this very important video. But it also underlies the importance of what people do in their everyday lives. People who take to the streets, people who read more and decide, I'm going to look into this issue a lot deeper. Jurors who decide that they were not going to let their prejudices sway what they see with their very eyes. And with court testimony that is based on, again, something that has moved people around the world, the killing of George Floyd, the notion of a cop, a symbol for many people of respect. But this cop, in this instance, sitting on the neck, kneeling on the neck of a black man, that symbolism is, I think, will be hard to get out of our minds. And we should let it out of our minds because it's relevant to so many other cases happening around this country where you don't see video.
Okay. Thank you all for joining me.